Before we start, tell me where you're watching from, and if you believe a dog can hear what the world refuses to see. It happened on a cold October afternoon in Eugene, Oregon. A young patrol officer and his German shepherd were walking their usual loop through Alton Baker Park. Same trail, same silence. Until Echo stopped. Just one bark, short, low, meant for someone who'd listen. What they uncovered beneath the wet leaves and broken roots was never supposed to be found. And yet, maybe it was Echo who was never supposed to forget. Would you have stopped walking if your dog barked once and didn't move? It wasn't panic. It wasn't play. It was a bark that said, "Stop walking. Something's waiting." The kind of bark that slices through a quiet afternoon, not with volume, but with weight. Luke Marlowe turned his head slowly. One boot paused mid-step on the damp gravel path. The leash in his hand had gone taut, not from resistance, but insistence. Echo, his canine partner of just 2 months, stood frozen near a thicket of leaf-heavy underbrush, tail rigid, ears pinned forward, eyes locked on something Luke couldn't yet see. Alton Baker Park always had a hush to it in the fall. By early October, the edges of Eugene, Oregon, dulled under low clouds and the faint, sour scent of wet leaves. The summer joggers had vanished, replaced by the occasional dog walker in thick coats, children bundled tight, drifting like thoughts across the empty grass fields. But that day, the silence was thicker than usual, and Echo, the German shepherd with a body like a coiled spring and the temperament of a monk, had stopped walking. Luke watched him for a beat, then followed the line of the leash forward. The old maintenance shed near the park's edge had been there since Luke was a boy, back when school trips brought him to feed ducks or run laps on the bike trail, back before his mother's illness, before foster homes, before he stopped believing parks were safe places for children. The shed was still standing, though barely. Moss clung to its sagging roof. A small window was fogged with mildew. No one used it. No one even glanced at it anymore. But Echo wasn't interested in the shed itself. He stood beside it, just a few feet beyond its crumbling frame, near a patch of low-slung brush where blackberry vines had tangled themselves into a mat of green and thorns. Luke took a slow step closer, his boots sinking slightly into the wet ground. Echo didn't move. He let out another bark. Just one. Deeper this time. Still not frantic. Still not afraid. Just certain. Luke crouched beside him, brushing away a few branches. There was nothing obvious. No smell, no sound, no movement in the trees overhead. But the air felt wrong. Still, as if the whole section of park had been paused, held in suspension. Echo began to sniff with sharp, deliberate intent. Then he lowered himself to the ground, pressed one paw forward into the tangle of leaves and mulch, and began to dig. Not wildly, not like a dog chasing a squirrel, but carefully, focused, measured. Every scrape of his claws peeled back layers of forgotten time. Luke said nothing, just watched. Echo's coat glistened faintly in the dim light, black with bands of muted rust along his ribs and legs. His breath came in steady huffs, and then a sound. Metal. Faint. Dull. Not a pipe. Not trash. It echoed back like a cough from the earth. Luke's fingers tensed on the leash. He reached for his gloves. When he brushed the leaves away, a square shape began to form beneath the dirt, edges too perfect for chance. A lid. A hatch, maybe. Iron or steel. Old. No handle. Just 4 bolts at each corner, eaten with rust. Luke's heartbeat slowed. Echo sat back, panting, eyes fixed on the hatch like it might speak. The world around them remained quiet. That quiet had changed somehow. It wasn't peaceful. It was listening. Luke stood and stepped back, hand on his radio, but paused when he heard shuffling footsteps on the gravel path behind him. An older woman, bundled in a green wool coat too big for her frame, was approaching slowly. Her face had the look of someone who'd been carrying a question too long. She stopped at the edge of the grass, her eyes on the hatch. "I think I know what that is," she said. Luke didn't speak. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, creased, worn, color fading at the edges. She held it out with both hands. A little girl, maybe 7, braces on her teeth, wearing a purple hoodie with a faded unicorn on the chest. The photo was dated 4 years ago. "She went missing," the woman said softly. "Right here, near the playground." Luke took the photo, studied it. His throat tightened, but he didn't show it. "They said she ran away," the woman added. "Said it happens sometimes, that age, but she never went anywhere without her inhaler. It was still in her backpack. They didn't believe me." Luke looked down at Echo, who was now lying beside the hatch, still watching, still waiting. "Maybe someone finally did," he said quietly. The woman didn't respond. She just stood there, hands tucked into her sleeves, rocking slightly on her heels, like she might collapse inward if she stopped moving. Luke turned back to the hatch. The wind picked up faintly, just enough to make the trees murmur. And still, Echo didn't look away. Some barks call for backup, others call for help, but this one was a reminder that something or someone had once tried to be heard. The next morning, the fog still hadn't lifted. It clung low to the grass like a memory that wouldn't leave. Luke stood beside the hatch, hands in his jacket pockets, watching as city engineers set up equipment. Echo sat a few feet back, still and quiet, his gaze fixed not on the people, but on the ground itself, as if waiting for it to exhale. There were no records, none. The hatch wasn't marked on any city infrastructure plans. The Parks and Recreation Department swore they'd never commissioned construction in that area. No storm drains, no irrigation systems, no utility lines. According to every map from the last 50 years, that patch of land was just dirt and trees. But there it was, an industrial-grade steel hatch, sunk 3 inches beneath the surface, sealed tight, unmarked, unmoving. A piece of something that didn't belong to anyone, which meant, Luke thought, it belonged to someone who didn't want to be found. The woman from the day before had returned, though no one asked her to. She kept her distance, standing near the bike racks by the trailhead, arms crossed over her chest. She didn't speak, just watched. In her hand she held the same photo, the corners now curled. The way she looked at the scene, it wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. Echo moved before anyone else did. He stood, took 3 steps forward, and sat again. 1 bark, short, final. Luke felt something shift in the base of his spine. He turned to the lead engineer, a middle-aged man with a clipboard and furrowed brow. "Can you get it open?" "Maybe," the man replied. "But you're not going to like what's underneath." They didn't need to pry. The bolts weren't welded shut, just aged and packed with layers of damp soil. After 15 minutes of careful brushing, the first screw lifted with a low, metallic groan. Luke watched as they cleared the rest. His hands never left his sides, but his knuckles were pale with pressure. Echo stayed exactly where he was. His tail didn't move. His ears twitched only slightly with every sound. Luke had seen him in action before, during a small search and rescue drill along the river trails a few weeks back. Echo never barked without reason, and he never sat still unless he was certain. Which meant whatever was buried here wasn't random. As the last bolt came free, the hatch gave a soft creak and shifted slightly. A hiss of trapped air escaped from underneath. Luke stepped closer, crouched, and brushed more dirt from the seams. What he saw then made the bottom of his stomach pull tight. Along one edge of the steel, barely visible, was a set of worn grooves, too uniform to be natural. Not letters, not numbers, just a pattern, like something had been moved back and forth, again and again, scratched into metal from below. He turned to Echo. The dog was standing now, body alert, nose twitching. His gaze was no longer fixed on the hatch. He was watching the trees beyond. That was when she approached. The older woman, slowly, hesitantly, clutching her coat like it might fly away in the breeze. Luke didn't wave her off. Something in her step felt necessary. She stopped at the edge of the clearing. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I remember when they first poured the new sidewalks here. Said it was to make the park more accessible." She looked at Luke. "That was the year she went missing." Luke didn't speak. His fingers brushed the edge of the hatch. "They said she wandered off. But kids don't wander off and leave behind everything that matters to them. She had asthma. Her backpack was still hanging on the monkey bars." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. "They told me to let go." That grief had a timeline. Luke felt a tightness in his throat he hadn't allowed in years. The woman stepped closer. "But something told me to come back. When I saw the photo in the news last night, the dog, he looks like the one she used to draw, over and over again, big, with watchful eyes." She crouched beside Echo, reaching out a hand slowly. The dog didn't move, just sniffed once, then sat beside her like he belonged there. Luke looked out over the scene, the engineers, the tape, the bystanders forming like ghosts in the distance, and felt something burn beneath his ribs. Not anger. Not yet. But the beginning of it. That low, flickering pulse of knowing something was done here, and no one had done anything about it. And beneath his boots, metal waited. By late afternoon, the rain had started. A light, uncommitted drizzle that darkened the leaves but couldn't wash away the weight in the air. The engineers had cleared the final layer of soil and were now pulling back the hatch with slow, deliberate movements. It opened with the stubborn groan of something that hadn't been disturbed in years, the kind of sound that felt like a warning more than a welcome. Luke stood just a few feet away, unmoving. His boots were rooted in the soft earth, shoulders squared not out of courage, but preparation. Echo was beside him, alert but still, the way dogs get when instinct overtakes training. The hatch opened halfway, revealing darkness so thick it felt like it might push back. There was no ladder, no lighting, just a narrow chamber dug into the ground, reinforced with concrete, lined with rusted bolts and patches of metal piping. At first glance, it could have been mistaken for an old service duct, a forgotten utility pit. But Luke didn't buy it. The walls were too precise. The air that drifted upward was cold and sterile, with a thin edge of something else, something faintly organic, like dust and paper and time. Echo leaned forward and sniffed once, then sat again. No bark this time, just waiting. One of the city workers dropped a small inspection camera down on a tethered cable. The feed came up on a tablet in grainy grayscale. Luke watched as the camera swung slightly before settling on the chamber floor. It was empty, dry, flat. But near the far wall, a single object stood out, metallic, box-shaped, blinking softly. "What is that?" someone muttered. The blinking was irregular, barely visible in the low-res video feed, but undeniably deliberate. Luke didn't wait for clearance. He stepped closer, crouched at the edge of the hatch, and leaned in. The cold hit his face first, then something else. A subtle vibration in the concrete, like a hum too low to hear but too steady to ignore. He stood up. "We need to pull it." It took another 30 minutes for the team to lower a cable loop and fish the device out. When they lifted it into the light, it was smaller than expected, roughly the size of a walkie-talkie, encased in scratched gray plastic. A simple recorder. No brand. No label. No visible buttons. Just one small switch on the side. They hesitated. Luke reached out and flicked it. The sound that emerged was soft at first, just static, like wind brushing across a microphone. Then a voice. Male, calm, slow. The kind of voice that didn't tremble, that didn't plead. "They didn't scream," it said. "They were taught not to." Silence followed. Then a mechanical click. End of message. No one said anything. The fog hung low again, almost as if it had returned just to listen. Luke felt something tighten in his jaw. His knuckles ached from clenching the edge of his jacket. Echo stood now, slowly approaching the recorder on the tarp like it might speak again. He sniffed once, then again, then turned toward Luke and whined, low, sharp, full of tension, not fear, not confusion, frustration. He pawed once at the ground, then sat down hard, eyes focused not on the device but on the trees. Luke followed his gaze. Nothing moved, but the silence had shape now. Wait, like an audience holding its breath. The city engineer turned toward Luke. This thing wasn't buried by accident. Someone knew what they were doing. Reinforced walls, no entry markings, soundproofed top layer. You don't get that from a storm drain. Luke didn't reply. Not yet. He stepped to the side, picked up the folded map of the park that had been taped to a clipboard since morning. He ran his fingers along the edges. Playgrounds, trails, maintenance lines. But not this. Not here. The area around the hatch was marked as unassigned green space. A blank spot. A deliberate omission. Behind him, the older woman had taken a seat on one of the old stone benches. Her photo rested in her lap, hands folded over it like a prayer. She wasn't crying, just watching. Echo returned to Luke's side. Sat. Pressed against his leg. Solid. Present. Luke's voice came quietly. "Run that recorder for prints." The forensic tech nodded. Luke glanced down at the hatch. The concrete around it now stained with footprints, equipment scuffs, and the wet outlines of paw pads. But one print, just near the edge of the chamber, stood out. Smaller. Lighter. Not from boots. Not fresh enough to be recent. But there. Distinct. A child's shoe. Echo sniffed it once, then lowered his head and gave a single, quiet exhale. Luke could feel the dog's breath warming the cuff of his pant leg. The storm hadn't started, but the ground had shifted, and deep below the surface, something had already begun. They opened the chamber at dusk. The sun hadn't set yet, but the sky had already turned the color of wet ash, and the trees at the edge of Alton Baker Park leaned inward as though trying not to see. Luke descended first, flashlight clipped to his chest, boots on the ladder, one rung at a time. The metal groaned under his weight. The air thickened with every foot he dropped. Echo waited above for 3 long seconds. Then he jumped. Luke flinched as the German Shepherd landed beside him with a soft thud. The dog's body was all tension and breath, fur bristling slightly as he turned to face the dark ahead. Luke didn't stop him. Some part of him knew Echo wasn't meant to wait. The flashlight beam swept across a corridor barely 6 feet wide. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and cold, braced with steel crossbars every 4 feet. No lights, no switches, just a single narrow hallway that stretched beyond the reach of the beam. Luke stepped forward. The soles of his boots pressed dust into the floor, leaving quiet, deliberate marks behind. The silence wasn't empty. It had a shape, a pressure, like sound itself had been removed by hand. Even the creak of his gear felt too loud. He lowered his voice to a whisper that never left his lips. "What is this place?" Echo moved ahead, not quickly, not uncertainly. His tail was stiff, his ears rotated with every breath, and then he stopped. There were doors. The first was metal, dull gray, no handle, just a narrow observation slot cut near the top. Luke approached slowly. The beam of his flashlight caught a faint smear across the metal, old, almost invisible. He reached out, traced it with his glove. Not paint, not rust. Something else. Organic. The slot was too narrow to see through clearly. Nothing inside. Just a hollow hush. Down the hall, Echo had stopped at another door. His body was lowered now, almost crouched, head tilted slightly as he pressed his nose to the seam. Then one bark, sharp, low, singular. Luke approached. He didn't ask why. He didn't tell him to stop. He just stood beside him and looked. The door was slightly ajar, no more than a hair's width. Not enough to see through, but enough to feel that something waited behind it. Luke's hand hovered over the edge. He didn't open it. Not yet, not without backup, not without air. He glanced at Echo. The dog sat back on his haunches and stared at the door with a look that wasn't alertness. It was memory. Luke marked the door. Number 4. The only one Echo had barked at. He moved back toward the first room, tried the latch. It was rusted shut. Another was locked entirely. Then another, where the door creaked open with the gentle resistance of forgotten places. The beam of his flashlight sliced across the interior like a scalpel. One mattress, metal frame, sagging in the middle. A thin gray blanket folded at the foot, stiff with age. A cracked plastic chair, pale with sun bleaching, and on the floor, a small red toy car missing 2 wheels. Luke stepped inside. The air was wrong, not foul, not moldy, just still, so still it felt like breath was a trespass. He crouched near the wall where faint marks lined the concrete. Scratches, not decorative. Not angry, just repeated. The same motions over and over, as if small hands had tried to turn panic into something manageable. Above them, a drawing. Faint lines in what looked like chalk or crayon. A stick-figure child with no mouth, no eyes, just a round head, and next to it, another figure. 4 legs, upright ears. A dog. Silent, but watching. Luke stared at it without blinking. The silence in the room thickened, turned inward. Behind him, Echo entered and walked toward the wall without hesitation. He sniffed the base of the drawing, then sat. Not protective, not defensive, as if he recognized something. Luke didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood in that small, forgotten room, next to a dog who had never been trained to read signs, but who had always known how to listen. He swept the light once more over the space, saw something small tucked beneath the mattress, a book, child-sized, its cover worn thin, edges chewed. He slid it free. On the first page, a single word in block letters. Quiet. Luke closed the book. The radio on his shoulder crackled softly with static. A voice above ground called his name. He didn't answer. Not yet. Echo stood and walked back to the hallway. Luke followed. They passed the other doors again. Some were locked. Some weren't. Each one a pause. Each one a possibility. But room 4, still shut, remained the one Echo had chosen. At the top of the ladder, the night had fallen completely. The air outside smelled like rain and streetlight. The engineers had gone home. The bench where the older woman had waited was now empty. Luke turned back toward the hatch. Echo stood beside it, not moving, not whining, just watching. There was something in that corridor that didn't want to be remembered, but Echo had remembered it anyway. The next morning, the air in Eugene had the kind of bite that settled behind the ribs and made breathing feel like memory. Luke sat alone in the precinct's old archive room, fluorescent lights humming faintly above his head, dust floating in slanted strips of morning sun through a narrow window. The air smelled like old boxes, cold coffee, and time no one wanted to revisit. The file boxes lined the back wall like gravestones. Most were unmarked beyond faded Sharpie scrawls. Unsolved, 2008. Runaway reports, 2012. Non-criminal juvenile missing. Luke scanned them with slow fingers, pausing every so often. Pulling one out like drawing a number from a jar you didn't want to win. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Only that Echo's reaction in the corridor hadn't come from training. It had come from knowing. And the kind of knowing that leaves marks isn't something a dog finds. It's something a dog remembers. Luke pulled a box labeled "C", Lost Cases, 2010-2016, and carried it to the table. The cardboard groaned under the weight of forgotten stories. Inside, manila folders, some barely held together with disintegrating paper clips. Photos, intake forms, incident reports, all printed with the kind of indifferent formatting that made every name look the same. Missing. No foul play suspected. Presumed runaway. He flipped through the first folder. A boy, age 9. Disappeared from a church playground in Salem. Last seen walking to his foster group van, never arrived. Next, a girl, age 6. Gone from her backyard while her mother was inside folding laundry. Then another. And another. All under 10. All disappeared within 5 miles of a public space. A park, a schoolyard, a trailhead. No suspects, no follow-up, no pattern recognized. But Luke saw it now. Not in the data, not in the reports, but in the space between the lines, the way they all had been written off. No one screamed, no broken windows, no blood. Just absence excused with paperwork and soft words like wandering or unstable home life. He rubbed his hands together, the skin on his knuckles tight and dry. This was more than forgotten cases. It was a pattern of adults who never believed the quiet was loud enough to matter. He closed his eyes, and for a second, something flickered behind the lids. Not the corridor, not room 4, but something smaller. A memory he hadn't invited. He was 8. A social worker named Jenna. A too-quiet house with yellow carpet and a man who always closed the door when he spoke. Luke had never told anyone, not because he was afraid, but because he had learned, young and clearly, that quiet was safer. And if you stayed still long enough, people forgot to ask. Echo had been the first presence in his life who didn't ask anything, just watched, waited, knew. Luke opened another folder, then another. His fingers moved faster now. A case from Portland. A boy age 7 disappeared from a parking lot beside a nature preserve. Another from Grants Pass, this one marked as delinquency. Luke read the final line aloud under his breath. Subject was known to fabricate stories for attention. A child. 7 years old. He sat back. The ache beneath his ribs deepened. Not sharp, just ever-present. Not pain, not yet. Just recognition. These weren't runaways. They were erased. Behind him, the door creaked open. He didn't turn. Echo padded in softly, paws silent on the linoleum floor. He moved straight to the corner of the room and curled up beside the radiator, nose resting on his front paws, eyes half closed. Luke watched him for a while. "You didn't need a reason," he said softly. "You just knew where to go." Echo blinked. Didn't move. Luke picked up the last folder in the stack. A name. Female. Age 7. Missing from Eugene. 4 years ago. His breath caught. It was the same child from the photo. The one the woman at the park still carried. He skimmed the report. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. Found backpack. No leads. Closed within 30 days. But tucked inside was a drawing. Crumpled, faded, still folded. Luke opened it carefully. A house. A tree. A small figure with pigtails and a larger one beside her. Not an adult. A dog. Black and tan. Upright ears, standing between the child and a dark shape drawn off to the side. Beneath the picture, in faint pencil. He stays. He listens. Luke stared at the paper. No name on the back. No note. But it didn't need one. Echo was now fast asleep, but his ears twitched once, then again. Luke placed the drawing beside him on the floor. The dog didn't open his eyes, but he laid one paw gently on the edge of the paper. And that was enough. The morning after the archive room, Luke woke before the sun. No alarm, just breath. Just the kind of wakefulness that doesn't begin with thought, but with pull. The house was still, cold beneath his feet. Echo lay by the front door, eyes open. He hadn't barked. He hadn't moved. But he was waiting. Luke didn't ask why. He put on his uniform in silence, clipped the leash with a quiet click, and they stepped out into the gray hush of Eugene before the town had stirred. Alton Baker Park looked different in the early hour. Without children's voices, without cyclists or joggers or city workers blowing leaves down empty sidewalks, it became something older. Raw. The air smelled of moss and distant rain. Fallen leaves had thickened overnight, matted across the footpaths like a second skin. The hatch was still sealed under a blue tarp, corners weighted with sandbags, flanked by temporary fencing. No one stood guard. Not anymore. Curiosity had faded with headlines. But not for Echo. The dog didn't stop at the hatch. He passed it without hesitation, veering left down a lesser-used path that curved past the edge of the playground and toward the abandoned service lot near the overgrown parking section. Luke followed, not because protocol said to, but because nothing in his body told him not to. Echo's gait wasn't rushed. He wasn't searching. He was returning. They reached a thicket of trees. Not the thick forest edge, just a shallow grove with scattered Douglas firs and maple trunks growing tight together, like secrets packed too close to breathe. Echo stopped near one, a wide-trunked maple with roots that buckled the ground beneath like the earth had tried to lift it. He barked once, not sharp, not urgent, but deliberate. Luke scanned the base of the tree. Nothing at first, just roots, leaves, a tangle of brambles that had collected trash from years past. Then, a shimmer of plastic. He crouched and brushed the debris away. A rectangle of thick, dirty polyethylene. Under it, wood. Weathered, softened at the corners. He pulled gently. The box came free, with a reluctant sigh, as if the ground hadn't yet decided to let go. It was handmade. No hinges. No lock. Just nailed sides, rough joints. The kind of thing a child might construct with scrap and determination. Inside, a stack of small items, each wrapped in waxed paper. Luke lifted one and peeled it back. A crayon drawing, faded, water-damaged. A child's hand, clearly. A circle meant to be a sun. A square house. Stick figures beneath the tree. One large, one small. And a dog. Always a dog. He opened another. A doll's shoe. Pink. Worn smooth. Another. A folded paper with shaky letters. Don't speak. He listens. Luke didn't breathe for a moment. His thumb moved across the edge of the note without pressing. These weren't objects. They were remains of trying. Messages left not for help, but for memory. Like the child who buried them had hoped that even if she wasn't found, something would remember she'd been there. Echo sat beside the box, not looking at it, looking past it, into the line of trees, as if expecting something to emerge. Luke felt a pressure at the base of his throat. The kind that didn't come from fear or sadness, but from something older. Recognition without knowing how. He placed the drawings back gently, as if they might crumble. Then he saw it, under the last piece of paper, stuck to the wood with a rusty thumbtack. A torn page from a library book. Children's section. The heading still legible. How to Build a Shelter Underground. He turned it over. On the back, in faint pencil, you can be quiet and still be brave. Luke stood slowly. The box in his hands felt heavier than it was. Echo didn't move. The breeze shifted, barely, just enough to make the branches overhead sigh. Luke looked at the tree. Its bark was marked with scratches, not random, not natural. Vertical lines, repeated, not like a tool, like fingernails, like someone had once held on there. He placed the box back where it had been, covered it again. Not to hide it, but to keep it safe. They moved again, Echo leading. Not fast, just steady. Every so often, he'd pause, sniff the air, then continue. Near the edge of the service lot, where the tree line thinned, Echo stopped cold. His body stiffened, tail dropped low, ears rotated forward. Luke raised his head. There, half sunken in the earth, was another shape, smaller than the last. Not wood, not plastic, fabric. A child's backpack, molded, torn, still zipped shut. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked to Echo. The dog didn't bark. He just sat, waited, listened. As if the woods still had something left to say. News didn't spread the way it used to. No sirens, no media vans, just whispers. A photograph passed between hands. A shared glance across a back fence. By the following week, the police station had received 6 phone calls and 2 unannounced visits, none of them from journalists, none demanding answers, all from women in their 60s or older, all carrying something the case files never had: memory. It was Wednesday afternoon when the front desk buzzed Luke. He had just finished reviewing soil composition reports from the latest excavation site in the park. Pointless on paper, but he read them anyway, because sometimes answers were buried in what looked like nothing. The voice on the intercom was tired. "Officer Marlowe, someone's here to see you. She says it's about the dog." Luke didn't correct her. He just stood, slipped his jacket on, and walked out. The woman was waiting in the lobby, seated, hands folded over a small envelope in her lap. She wore a brown coat, frayed at the collar. Her shoes looked like they had once belonged to someone else. She looked up when he entered, not hopeful, not nervous, just waiting. "You're the one with the dog," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded, more to herself than to him. Then, "I used to teach 2nd grade, retired now. But back then, mid-90s, I had a student, quiet boy, smart, loved drawing, animals mostly, wolves, big dogs. Used to tell me he had one who followed him to school. No leash, just followed. I always thought he was making it up." Luke didn't speak. "Then one day," she continued, "he stopped coming to class. Parents said he ran away. Said he stole money and took off." Her eyes met his. "But that boy brought me a picture once. Said he made it for me. I kept it. For reasons I never understood. Until I saw your dog on the news. Until I saw that door in the ground." She handed him the envelope. Inside was a piece of yellowed construction paper, folded once. On it, drawn in crayon, was a square building with no windows, a line for a door. Above it the words, "Quiet Place." In front of the building, a figure, small, stick arms, no mouth. Beside it, a dog, upright ears, amber eyes drawn with deliberate strokes. Luke looked up. "You reported this?" She shook her head. "To who? The school counselor? They told me to let it go. Said he was troubled, imaginative. I tried to push once, and they told me I was interfering with an active police matter. I wasn't tenured yet. I stopped pushing." Echo padded into the room, having slipped his friend past the back hall door. He didn't go to Luke. He walked slowly to the woman and sat in front of her. Quiet, present. Her hand, shaking slightly, reached down to touch his head. He didn't move. "Is this him?" she asked, voice thin. Luke hesitated. He wasn't assigned to the boy, but he might have been near. Her hand rested lightly behind Echo's ear. "There's something else, Fasam," she said, almost as an afterthought. "I kept one more thing. A note the boy wrote. It never made sense to me until now." She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded scrap of notebook paper. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, but readable. "Don't forget the dog. He knows where the quiet starts." Luke read it twice. Then again. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a plea. It was a reminder, meant for someone who might not believe anything else. She stood. "I don't know if that helps. I just thought someone should have it. Someone who listens." Luke nodded. "It helps." She gave Echo one last look, then walked slowly back through the double doors and disappeared into the wash of streetlight and drizzle outside. That night, Luke sat at his desk long after most had left the precinct. The envelope and its contents lay open beside him. Echo lay beneath the desk, unmoving. Except for his ears, which twitched now and then at sounds no one else seemed to hear. Luke opened his notebook, one he hadn't touched in weeks. On the first page he had written, "They were always here." He turned to a blank page, wrote 3 words. "They were believed," then closed the notebook without a sound. The map said the park ended near the river, where the soil turned swampy and trees leaned in like old men too tired to stand straight. But Echo didn't know maps. He followed scent, wind, and something older. Impression, maybe. Or memory that wasn't his own. They returned the following evening. Sunset bled across the tree line like rust. Luke had stopped checking in. He still carried his radio, still wore the badge, but his steps no longer served the precinct. He was following Echo now, and Echo had learned not to look back. They crossed past the playground, past the maintenance trail, and toward an area where the undergrowth thickened unnaturally. The kind of place even children wouldn't wander into, even in daylight. Echo slowed, sniffed, took a few steps, then paused near a stand of buckthorn and blackberry. The thorns clung to his fur, but he didn't flinch. His nose lowered toward the earth. Then, a bark. One short sound, controlled, as if to say, "Here." Luke crouched beside him. The soil was different, sunken slightly. A depression that hadn't been natural. Beneath layers of rotted leaves and pale moss, his fingers struck metal. Luke scraped gently, a hatch, smaller than the first, older, hinged on one side, not locked. He didn't call for backup, didn't photograph it. He simply listened. Nothing. Then, his hand moved to the latch. The door opened with a slow, wet groan. The air inside was colder than it should have been. Dry and still. He clicked on his flashlight. A narrow tunnel, just high enough to crouch. Wood-paneled sides, darkened with time and moisture. Unlike the concrete chamber from before, this one felt personal, built not with government money or anonymous hands, but pieced together by someone with secrets to keep and no blueprints to follow. Echo entered first. Luke followed, careful not to brush the sides. The air felt old, like it had been held in someone's lungs too long. At the end of the tunnel, A door. Wooden. No handle. Just a push plate smudged with prints too small to be his. He pushed. The room beyond was small, 8 by 10 feet, maybe less. The walls were painted with patchy coats of white, not evenly, as if done by a child. A single cot, threadbare and low, a shelf built from milk crates. On it, a half-burned candle, a plastic spoon, a broken pencil, and a thick stack of papers, held together by a rubber band. But what caught Luke's breath was the wall. Dozens of drawings. Crayon, charcoal, broken ink pens, pages torn from spiral notebooks, flyers, even the back of cereal boxes. All pinned or taped up. Some were abstract, swirls, lines, frantic shapes. Others were clear, faces, trees, doors, but always a dog. Sometimes small and curled beside a bed, sometimes standing in front of a door, once with its back to the viewer, staring out across a bridge. In every image, upright ears, dark coat, amber eyes. Echo walked to the corner of the room and sat, his tail motionless behind him, his head tilted slightly, watching. Luke approached the wall. His hand hovered over a particular drawing, newer than the rest. It had been pinned up with care. On it, a child and a dog. The child stood facing the viewer. Thin arms, bony knees, hair drawn in heavy strokes. In one hand, a crayon-drawn police badge. In the other, he held the dog's leash. But the dog wasn't tethered. The leash hung loose between them. Luke knelt. There were no names, no dates, no cries for help. But on the corner of the paper, almost hidden by tape, a message scrawled in faint, uneven pencil. Still here. He stared at those words longer than he needed to, not for evidence, but because in that moment, he felt it. Not the presence of someone, but the absence of hopelessness. A noise broke the silence. Echo, shifting his weight. He stood. Walked to the opposite side of the room, where a square cut had been made into the wall, some kind of makeshift vent or crawl opening. His nose pressed near it. Then he barked. Not sharp, not loud, but full. Luke approached. He knelt, flashlight in hand. The vent led to another shaft, barely wide enough to crawl through. At the end, just visible in the circle of light, was something hanging from a nail. A fresh piece of paper. Blank, except for a single word. Draw. Luke exhaled slowly. He didn't crawl through. Not yet. He backed away. Sat beside Echo. The room held its silence. Not empty, just waiting. He looked at the wall again. All those children, all those dogs, all those unheard things. Somewhere out there, someone was still drawing. And Echo? He had found the door again. The light had changed. It always did after the 5th hour of being underground. Colors dulled, even from the flashlight. The skin on Luke's knuckles looked gray. The air wasn't dangerous yet, but it had that stale weight, like it was no longer meant for lungs. Echo didn't seem to care. He waited by the small crawl space, ears forward, tail low, not alert, not tense, just ready. Luke hesitated. There was no training manual for this. No protocol for what to do when a child draws your dog again and again from the dark. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a small protein bar, unwrapped it. The crackle echoed against the walls. He tore it in half and tucked one piece into his coat. Then he crawled. The shaft was narrower than it had looked. The flashlight scraped against the walls. At one point, his shoulder stuck, and he had to shift to his side, feeling the cool earth pressing in. The air got colder. He could feel Echo's breath just behind him. 10 feet in, it opened into a larger hollow, a storage space once, maybe, though no one had stored anything here in years. The floor was dirt. A wooden crate, rotted at the corners, sat in one corner. A blanket lay half-folded across it, faded cartoon characters barely visible in the beam of the flashlight. Luke stopped moving. In the far corner, behind a stack of old paint cans, someone watched him. Eyes first, wide, unblinking. Then, the shape of a child emerged, thin, wrapped in layers that didn't match. A coat too big, pants cut at the knees, no shoes, no movement, just the eyes. Luke didn't speak. He lowered the flashlight beam so it wouldn't hit the child's face. Slowly, without shifting his weight, he opened his hand. In it, the other half of the protein bar. He placed it gently on the ground. Then he waited. Echo, still behind him, gave one soft whine, barely audible. It wasn't a plea, more like acknowledgement. The child moved. A shuffle at first, then, on hands and knees, crawled forward. Not fast, as if expecting the moment to break. He reached the food, looked at Luke once, then at Echo. That's when something shifted. The child's fingers, dirty and chipped, gripped the bar, but he didn't eat. He held it. Eyes locked on Echo. Then, without sound, without decision, he crawled toward the dog. Luke didn't breathe. Echo didn't move. The boy reached him, one hand extended, trembling not from cold, but uncertainty. When his fingers touched Echo's fur, something inside him broke, but not in the way pain breaks. It was smaller, a quiet unraveling. He leaned forward, buried his face in Echo's neck, and stayed there. Echo didn't lick him, didn't shift away, just stood still, head low, body calm, as if he'd been waiting for this exact weight to press against him. Luke crawled forward slowly. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He placed a gentle hand on the child's back. The boy flinched, then stilled. Moments passed. Then, with effort, the boy whispered, "I saw you." Luke's breath caught. When? In the picture. You're real. He pulled back. His face was pale, eyes glassy. One cheek had a fading bruise, but there was no fear, just exhaustion, deep, ancient exhaustion. Luke nodded. "Yeah, I'm real. And we're going home." The boy looked confused. "Where's home?" Luke didn't answer. He just took off his coat and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. Then picked him up, weightless. The kind of weight that stays in the mind longer than the arms. As he crawled back through the shaft, holding the boy to his chest, Echo led the way. Step by step. No rush, no bark. Just the rhythm of pause on earth. When they emerged, the sky was pale with morning. Mist rolled across the river. The world had moved forward. No one knew what had just happened beneath their feet. Luke sat on the ground, cradling the child. The boy's head rested against his chest. Eyes closed but not asleep. Echo sat beside them. They stayed like that for a long time. No words. A jogger passed by on the far trail, unaware. A duck called out from the riverbank. A leaf landed softly on Luke's shoulder and slid down into the boy's hair. Finally, Luke whispered, not to the boy, not even to Echo, just to the air. We got one out. One. He didn't cry, but his hand shook as he reached for Echo's neck and scratched behind his ear, not as a reward, but as thanks. Because the child had been found, and maybe, in the quiet that followed, a man had been found too. Autumn slipped into winter quietly that year, as if the seasons understood some things shouldn't be disrupted. The river slowed. The leaves stopped resisting. And Alton Baker Park, once just a stretch of green along the Willamette, became something else entirely. They never said the boy's name publicly. It was a choice, not an oversight. His face wasn't in the papers. No cameras rolled when he was brought in. Only a few people knew, and none of them were interested in glory. Least of all Luke. The official report was short. Unidentified minor found in Wooded Park region. Condition, stable, protective services notified. No mention of the drawings. No mention of the other hatch. No mention of Echo. But the precinct knew. Quietly, with glances and pauses in the hallway, they acknowledged something had shifted. Luke came in less often, but when he did, he walked differently. Lighter, maybe, or simply whole. He didn't give interviews. When the city offered to honor him, he declined. But they didn't ask Echo. So one morning, without ceremony, they placed a small bronze plaque at the edge of the old trail, the place where everything had begun. To the ones who listened when no one else did. It didn't mention names, just words, because that's what Luke had asked for. Not recognition, just remembrance. The boy had been moved to a care home in the outskirts of Eugene. Luke visited sometimes. Not often. He never stayed long. The boy didn't speak much, but he would draw. Always the same themes. Doors, dogs, rivers, and hands. Once he handed Luke a picture. Echo standing on the edge of a trail, tail raised, looking not at something, but for someone. Luke didn't keep it framed. He slid it behind the visor of his patrol car. Every time the sun came through the windshield, the edges curled a little more. Most mornings he and Echo still walked the park. They didn't take the main trail anymore. Instead, they wandered, past the old maintenance shed, along the narrow deer paths where moss grew thickest. Echo would pause now and then, nose to the wind, ears flicking. But he didn't bark. Not anymore. Because he didn't need to. He'd already done what needed doing. Sometimes children passed by with parents, holding leashes too loose for dogs too small. They'd point at Echo, still tall, still dark, still steady, and whisper. A few asked to pet him. Luke always waited for Echo to decide. Some days, the dog leaned forward, let a hand touch him. Other days, he stepped back. Not unfriendly. Just aware. One morning, a small girl sat on a bench near the water. Her mother was on the phone. The girl watched Echo with eyes too old for her age. When Luke paused, she didn't speak. She just opened her backpack and pulled out a notebook, tore a page. She handed it to Luke without a word. On it, a simple sketch. A dog and a boy. The dog's leash rested on the ground between them. The boy's hands were open. Luke looked down at the girl. She shrugged. He looked like someone I saw in a dream, she said, then ran off to catch her mother. He folded the drawing and slid it into his coat pocket, beside the first one. Nothing was neat. Nothing resolved. But it was enough. That afternoon, as the sun dropped low and lit the park in amber, Luke stopped by the trailhead where the plaque sat. He placed a stone on top of it. Nothing engraved, just something to catch the eye. Echo sat beside him, ears relaxed, tail brushing the fallen leaves. A breeze moved through the trees, stirring what hadn't been touched all day. Luke closed his eyes. Not praying, just listening. Because now he understood. Some barks weren't to alarm or to warn. Some barks were the voice of a soul refusing to let silence win. And some souls came with fur, and eyes like amber, and a patience the world didn't deserve. As they stood to leave, Echo turned once, looked toward the river. No sound, just a long breath out, the kind you take when you know you've done something that matters. Luke placed a hand on his shoulder, and together, without a word, they walked back into the soft, forgiving quiet. Not every story ends with answers. Some end with someone finally being heard. Echo never barked for glory. Luke never searched for medals. But somehow, in the quiet, between a child's drawing and a dog's silence, they became what the world forgot it needed. Someone who stays. Sometimes the greatest rescues aren't loud. They're made of stillness, of sitting beside someone long enough for them to breathe again. If you've ever had a moment where you felt someone, man or dog, truly listened to what you couldn't say out loud, tell us in the comments. Or just type, "I've heard the bark," because maybe, just maybe, the quiet ones are still calling out, and someone like you might be the one who hears them.